Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video will be a revisit on INTJs. And first and foremost, what I would like to say about the INTJ personality type is that they are actually qualitative in their nature and not objective in their nature, as I postulated before in the previous video. And the reason for this revision is that there is a duality and a multiplicity to their personal makeup. That the core of the INTJ, though their meta question is what is the good life, they are fundamentally humanist. They are the humanist of the rational thinking types. They share this with ENTJs as they value what it means to be human and what is the human experience, and are so deeply concerned with the question of what is a human being and what should a human being's concerns be towards, and how should they best act in response to what the environment is and what constitutes reality. They are sleuths. They are sleuths, as in they're detectives and agents. They use a palette of content from the metaphysical and innate anthropomorphic landscape that's generated by introverted intuition to create items of organization and hierarchy in a hierarchy of needs and understanding, as they are epistemically driven, but they're epistemically driven for functional, rational volition. And so they certainly are the types that need to be out in the environment and looking at things and drawing their ethics, their morality, and their nature from. They're making themselves up, and they make themselves up as individuals, much like INFPs, because of the fact that they are ethical agents. It comes from their introverted feeling, and they're beholden to the humanistic qualities that make them up. They have a vigor and an intensity and a passion that comes to them, for they are the rational that can be excited by the environment. They are excited by the actions of people. They're susceptible to things. Despite their aloof appearance, there is a very there can be a very dispassionate exterior about them, but they are fundamentally excitable. And what I mean by they're fundamentally excitable is that they're using their eyes. They're always using their eyes within the environment. They're using their eyes to see what's going on. They're taking and cross-referencing their vision with their other senses, with the modalities and the proprioceptive natures that happen in their body. And they use this tendency to be one who lives through the embodied nature of themselves to rejuvenate themselves and even orientate themselves in the world when they're a bit confused and they're lost. It's why they make some of the best empiricists that you will find in history, because they do have a code of correspondence to them. It is why they have a familiarity and a liking for facts in some regards in terms of constructing their theoretical models. They construct theoretical models like an INTP because they do have polar introverted thinking in their functional stack, but they're also trying to come to conclusions in determining what it is to be human and how they ought to live. They have this idea of a good life, and they're in pursuit of it. It does not mean necessarily that they're trying to overcome the world always, or that they irrationally take and champion their desires over what they can make up of concrete reality. They are using their understanding of the natural world to best make up the picture of how they ought to think and act and orientate themselves towards others. They will be iconoclastic and individually based as they champion their autonomy, because they understand life as a burden and a struggle in some respects between the forces of nature and the desires and the innate and almost innocent desires of the human animal. And it's the idea that rationality for them is a agent and a gospel-like savior to the plight of the world, because they find that using sense and using things that we can structure through thought, language, and consideration, and using those things, we can find that we have greater power over the forces that come against us. And that is what they stand in opposition towards in some ways, and their being is that they want to stand for who they are and what it means to be human, and they stand for who they are and what it means to be human before they're ready to capitulate. They're not going to capitulate, and they're not going to give themselves over to nature. They're not going to capitulate, and they're not going to give themselves over to institutions. They can be leaders of institutions, and they can put up with the bullshit in some respects, as they don't trouble and worry themselves about things that are inevitable and that they can't control in some respects. But they don't let those cases stay at rest, and they don't let them stay settled, for even if they're passive, they're the overcoming agents in this world. They overcome things because they like the sensuality to life, and they're aesthetic creatures. As Nietzsche even said, life is better lived as an aesthetic experience, and they enjoy food. They enjoy just the sensual, and it's why even with my INTJ friend, we can go to art galleries and we get one another as we're looking at a picture by Monet, or we're looking at some representation of something done by Michelangelo, or we're looking at an impressionistic piece. When we're looking at these things, we're experiencing a palette of almost like a spiritual experience. Spirituality is a transcendent chord in them, in this way that they have a shudderance in movement towards aesthetics that gives them the appreciation for creativity. It gives them the appreciation for tragedy. It gives them the appreciation for comedy. It gives them appreciation and a depth and a flavor as a rational type that kind of sometimes will fall deaf on my more stringent and sterile and rigid internal self, as they are the type of thinker that has to be in the world and live and experience it, and has a kind of a deeper metaphysical basis to them that is seldom understood or seen. And it's what I call it sensitivity, but you could consider it excitability. I don't know what's necessarily the best way to say it in terms of exact terminology, but I do know within an INTJ that there is this motion and dynamic to their internal space that is not privy to the outside world, and not even obvious in their actions, as they're highly imaginative individuals, that they do not need a lot of guidance and governing from the external world in terms of the creation of their thought space, because it is a palette of existential items, logical items, and archetypal items that sort themselves out and arrange themselves and interwoven and multifaceted and interestingly idiosyncratically arranged hierarchies that there is a tendency for the rational and the irrational to do perfect harmonies and blends in themselves, much like an INFJ in some respects, as they can be poets in some ways when they're talking about what makes rational sense. And I even take the epic Homerism in some respects that I can present in my description of types from the way that Nietzsche will describe things, or from the way that Plutarch or Homer or Shakespeare described the human existence, because there's something very real about the FITE axis, as it is the creation of characters, as they know how they are characters and they know how to make the self. They know how to live best as people, and they're continually revising and investigating this picture, and they only see the picture of rationality and logic as it best corresponds with what it means to be human, what it means to be man. They will not necessarily value the feelings of others, but they do value the makeup of what it is to be a person. And they think that, very really, that they come with gospels. I guess that's the best way I can say it. An INTJ always comes with gospels, and they always have intentionality to them that is not easily understood nor seen by other people. They're constructivists in the sense that they go out looking into the world, investigating things, and making up a map of understanding of what is, as in they're phenomenologists, but they're also empiricists in this way. And they're figuring out how they ought to orientate themselves towards these things. There are different degrees of variability that don't necessarily have something to do with them being an INTJ exactly, that gives the tendency to climb dominance hierarchies and other things that are popularly associated with them. But it's just that an INTJ is just figuring out what this world is. They're figuring out what this world is, what they are, and what people are. And they're taking and doing these investigations and deciding how to act in accordance with these investigations. And when they're deciding how to act in accordance with these investigations, they're developing this notion of what the good life is, and they're also they're developing this notion of what the good life is, and they're also developing this notion of how they ought to be. How they ought to be, and what should be aspired. Well, what should be aspired for? What should be championed? What values are important? And what values are most important in terms of a salience between a rational cohesion and a I would say homeostasis between man as the rational animal and man as the barbarian in some respects, or just the homely creature and the sort of naturally, biologically instantiated elements that come by way of our evolutionary history. They're figuring out how all these things need to fit together. They're figuring out how all these things need to fit together in the championing of mankind, as they are the humanists, and they can't, and this is something to say about humanism, is that humanism is a very broad philosophical attitude. It's not an ideology, but it's a broad philosophical attitude that houses several schools of philosophy within it, as philanthropy, egalitarianism, existentialism, nihilism, misanthropy, and a few other things are humanistic philosophies. Though they all are very they're different from one another, and some very fundamental and some very superficial ways. But it's to say that that range of expression in terms of the human condition is inside of the INTJ. They are always saying that knowledge is, man is not the servant of knowledge, but knowledge is the servant of man. And they respect the differences in people, and they respect the individual differences that make up people, because they think that a space where all can exist in some sort of equilibrated harmony, those receiving what they deserve in terms of their capabilities and the meritocratical order of things, the meritocratical natural ordering of things is appropriate, but none should be lost. And what is fair is what is fair by way of the governing of competitive metrics and solace and kindness even to their fellow man in terms of our limitations and what we can do to better ourselves and shed us of our, or mitigate in some respects, the lesser appealing aspects of our nature. And it's to say that the INTJ will be the investigative agent about what it means to be human and what this world is and what it means to be in this world and what we ought to do about it. If you ever are at a loss for direction in some respects on how you ought to act, go talk to an INTJ. Because though they come with labels like pragmatist, though they come with labels like scientist, and they have this tendency